We lost. They will defile us. The whisper ran through the narrow alley like an unspoken decree. Sachiko, cut your hair short, dress like a man, and stay inside. Women huddled in front of crumbling houses, eyes darting in fear. Those with valuables buried them in the ground, locked their chests, or tore family crests from old kimono sleeves. Young girls sheared their hair, wrapped their heads in cloth, and wore loose men's coats to hide their shape. Some quietly slipped a small vial of poison into their sleeves, ready for the worst. Years of indoctrination had taught them that defeat was shame, that honor was worth more than life itself. News spread that American troops would occupy the city, and fear grew with every foreign bootstep echoing down the empty streets. Sachiko stood at the doorway, fingers tightening on the edge of her worn kimono. She heard it all, saw it all, and thought only one thing. From today on, she must live as if she did not exist. The summer air of 1945 hung heavy with soot. The sky over Tokyo was still gray from the last air raid, and the smell of burnt paper lingered in every breath. Sachiko's house stood half-broken, its roof patched with sheets of tin that rattled whenever the wind sighed. A framed photo of her husband, Lieutenant Haruto Sato, rested on a shelf that had survived the blast. He had died in the Philippines 2 years earlier. The army had sent a wooden box with his name carved in black ink, and a letter that said nothing about how he died, only that he had served honorably for the emperor. She had not cried that day. The tears had dried out long before the surrender. She had lived through the bombings, through the ration cards, through the endless nights of air raid sirens and waiting for fire to find her street. But now, when the radio announced Japan's unconditional surrender, her knees went weak. It wasn't just the loss of the war, it was the loss of everything she had been told to believe in. Outside, the neighborhood fell into a strange quiet. Even the crows stopped calling. Women swept ashes from their doorsteps without a word. Men stared at the ground, their uniforms stripped of insignia. The emperor's voice had been thin and distant through the static, so calm, so polite, that it almost sounded like someone else's tragedy. Sachiko sat by the window, watching the last flags being taken down. A small boy tried to fold one neatly, but the fabric was too scorched to hold its shape. It crumbled in his hands like dried leaves. She turned away, heart tightening. Somewhere far off, the low rumble of trucks rolled closer. Rumors came before the soldiers did. That Americans were giants with pale skin and cruel eyes, that they took what they wanted, that they dragged women away. Every whisper added another stone of fear to the pit of her stomach. Yet there was also another rumor, quieter, almost forbidden, that the Americans had orders from their general, Douglas MacArthur, not to harm civilians, not even to carry guns in public. Some called it propaganda, others called it a lie meant to disarm them. Sachiko didn't know what to believe. That night, she and her mother lit a single candle at the family altar. The old woman prayed for Haruto's spirit and for the safety of her daughter. "If they come," her mother said softly, "don't speak. Don't look at them. They respect strength, not tears." Sachiko nodded, though her throat felt dry. When the candle burned low, she wrote a line in her husband's journal. "The war is over, but fear has only just begun." The next morning, the air smelled of diesel and sea salt. From the edge of the alley, people began to gather, their faces pale in the gray light. The sound came first, the deep growl of engines, the rhythmic crunch of boots. Then they appeared. American soldiers. They moved in a column along the ruined street, their uniforms dusty, their helmets dull under the sun. They were not the monsters the whispers had painted, nor the gods of victory from the newsreels, just tired young men carrying their packs, their rifles slung but not raised. One of them, tall and fair-haired, turned his head briefly toward the crowd. Sachiko's breath caught. He smiled, an uncertain, almost apologetic smile, and then looked away. No one waved. No one spoke. The soldiers passed like ghosts between two worlds, and the people of Tokyo watched in silence, as if afraid that even their breath might provoke something terrible. When they were gone, only the echo of their boots remained, and the faint scent of tobacco and foreign soap. Sachiko closed the door slowly. For the first time since the bombing, she realized her hands were trembling, not from hatred, but from something she couldn't yet name. That night, she dreamt of her husband standing by the sea, calling her name. But when she ran toward him, he turned into one of the soldiers she had seen that morning, his eyes blue instead of brown. She woke before dawn, her heart beating hard against her ribs, and whispered into the darkness, "Haruto, forgive me. I don't know who the enemy is anymore." The morning they came, the city seemed to hold its breath. From far down the main road came a sound the people had not heard before, the steady hum of engines, the clatter of metal on stone. Someone shouted that the Americans were at the bridge. Women pulled children inside. Shop doors slammed shut. Even the wind felt cautious, as if it too feared the sound of victory. Sachiko stood by the cracked window and saw the dust rising first. Then the jeeps appeared, olive green and foreign, moving through the rubble that had once been streets. The men in them were not monsters. They looked exhausted, sunburned, too young for their uniforms. None of them carried rifles at the ready. MacArthur's orders had been clear. No weapons displayed, no violence, no fear. They marched with their sleeves rolled, helmets tilted back, eyes searching the ruins like men trying to understand what kind of world they had entered. The first jeep stopped near the well at the end of the alley. A soldier climbed out, tall, broad-shouldered, with dust clinging to his boots. He took a few steps, looked around, then lifted a small box from the vehicle. He set it on the ground and opened the lid. Inside were cans of milk and small packets of biscuits. He called something in English, words the people couldn't grasp, and gestured toward the children hiding behind their mothers. No one moved. Then, a single child, maybe 5 years old, stepped forward. He was barefoot, his clothes hanging in rags. The soldier crouched, smiled gently, and handed him a can. The boy took it, trembling. For a heartbeat, the alley was silent. Then, slowly, an old woman muttered, "He gave it, not took it." The words spread faster than rumor. Within minutes, more soldiers came, unloading boxes marked with white stars and strange English letters. Medical, food, relief. They spoke softly, always in pairs, never entering a house uninvited. Sachiko watched from the shadows, trying to understand. Her mother whispered behind her, "Don't trust them. It's a trick." First kindness, then chains. Sevens. But Sachiko kept watching. The way one man tied a splint to a child's injured leg. The way another gave up his own water bottle to an old man who could barely stand. These were not the faces she had imagined when she heard the word enemy. That night, the loudspeakers crackled with a new voice, calm, firm, foreign. It was the Occupation Command reading a message from General Douglas MacArthur. The translation followed, broken and stilted. The Allied forces will not bring punishment, but peace and rebuilding. People listened in disbelief. Some spat on the ground. Others whispered prayers. Sachiko said nothing. She could not decide if mercy from the victor was kindness or another kind of humiliation. In the following days, the soldiers set up their camp in the burned-out school. The building still smelled of ash and wet plaster. They built fences, not to keep people out, but to protect their supplies from thieves. Children gathered at the edges, curious. Some waved shyly. When the soldiers waved back, mothers pulled the children away. The memory of war was still too fresh. One morning, while walking to the ration office, Sachiko saw a group of women kneeling by the roadside. They were gathering broken bricks, clearing debris to make room for trucks. Among them were a few American soldiers, working silently beside them. One of them looked up, the same tall man from the jeep, the one who had handed milk to the boy. He smiled at her again, that same uncertain, respectful smile. She turned away quickly, cheeks burning, not from shame, but from confusion. The next day, she found her mother boiling water with a new tin pot. "Where did you get this?" Sachiko asked. "From the relief truck. They said it's for families with widows. I didn't want to take it, but they insisted." Her mother's voice trembled between pride and gratitude. They even bowed. "Foreigners, bowing to us." Later that week, a printed notice appeared on every wall, both in English and in awkward Japanese. "Citizens of Tokyo, Allied forces come not as conquerors, but as friends. No harm will come to those who keep peace." People read it, laughed bitterly, or tore it down. Yet no soldiers stormed the houses. No one was dragged away. The days passed, quiet but strange. Sachiko began to walk outside again, cautiously, always keeping to the sides of the street. The soldiers would nod, sometimes tip their helmets. She never replied. But one evening, at the well, she saw a small boy struggling with a bucket too heavy for him. The same American, she would later learn his name was David Miller, knelt down and helped lift it. Then he looked at Sachiko, pointed at the bucket, and said a single word: "Water." She hesitated, then nodded slightly. "Mizu," she said in Japanese. He repeated it, clumsy but earnest. "Mizu." For the first time since the surrender, Sachiko almost smiled. When she returned home, her mother asked what had made her cheeks so warm. "Nothing," Sachiko said, placing the bucket down. "Just, the Americans are strange. They don't look like victors." Her mother sighed. "Don't be fooled by manners. A sword can hide under kindness." But as the night deepened and the sound of boots faded beyond the hill, Sachiko sat by the window again. For the first time in months, she did not feel watched. She wondered if perhaps the war had truly ended, not in the surrender speech, but in the quiet act of a man who learned to say Mizu. Winter crept in quietly that year, and the smell of smoke mixed with cold air. The Americans had been in Tokyo for weeks now, maybe months. Time had begun to lose its edges. The bombing had stopped, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than the noise ever was. Buildings still lay broken. Some streets had no names anymore, only ashes and memories. The occupation office began distributing rice. Not much, half a bowl per person, but it was white rice, not the coarse barley people had eaten for years. People queued in long lines under the pale sun, standing beside soldiers who spoke words they did not understand. Peace, help, friendship. Words that floated like smoke, too light to hold. Sachiko joined the line one morning, her ration book clutched tightly in her hand. She watched the American soldiers move among the people, checking papers, lifting crates. One of them stood near the front, a young man with sandy hair, his uniform sleeves rolled up to the elbows. She recognized him, the same soldier from the well. He was writing something in a small notebook, his brow furrowed in concentration. When it was her turn, he looked up. Their eyes met for a heartbeat. "Name?" he asked slowly. She hesitated, unsure if he meant to take something from her. He tapped the paper again, patient. "Sachiko," she said, each syllable careful, like stepping on cracked ice. He smiled slightly and repeated, "Sachiko." The sound of her own name in his accent startled her. It sounded softer, less like a name of someone who had lost everything. He handed her the small bag of rice with both hands, a gesture that mimicked the Japanese way of respect. She bowed without meaning to, and he nodded back. That night, Sachiko cooked the rice for her mother. They hadn't eaten white rice since before Haruto left for war. The grains gleamed like tiny pearls in the dim light. Her mother ate slowly, tears running down her face. "It tastes like the past," she whispered. "Maybe even like forgiveness." But not everyone felt that way. The next morning, a neighbor came knocking, her voice sharp. "I saw you talking to them. You bowed. Do you want people to think you've forgotten your husband?" Sevens. Sachiko froze. Shame rose hot in her chest. "I didn't." "You should be careful," the woman hissed. "There are still men who fought. They see things. They remember." That evening, Sachiko stayed inside. The walls felt close, the air thick. Outside, laughter drifted from the soldiers' camp, low, easy, human. She tried to hate it, but it only reminded her how quiet her own house had become. A week later, she was assigned to work part-time cleaning at the district office. The building had once been a school. Now, half of it was used by the American administration. They needed help sweeping, carrying papers, boiling water. It wasn't prideful work, but it was better than waiting for handouts. The first morning she arrived, she was given a broom and told to stay on the Japanese side of the hall. Through the open door, she saw the Americans at their desks, talking, laughing, drinking coffee. They moved differently from Japanese officers, looser, less formal, but with an energy that filled the room. At one corner sat the soldier from before. He was drawing lines on a map, lips moving as he murmured English words she couldn't follow. Once, he looked up and caught her glance. Instead of turning away, he raised his hand slightly, as if to greet her. She pretended not to see. During lunch, she sat on the steps outside, eating cold rice balls. The soldier came out a few minutes later, carrying a metal cup of coffee. He hesitated, then said something, slowly, carefully. "Cold?" He pointed at her hands. She frowned, unsure if he was offering or asking. "Cold," he repeated, tapping his chest. "Me too." Then he smiled, almost shyly. Sachiko didn't answer, but when he walked back inside, she found herself looking after him. Later, as she swept the hallway, she overheard two older clerks whispering. "They say General MacArthur himself ordered the soldiers not to carry rifles in public. He wants to show we are not their enemies anymore. Or maybe it's to make us drop our guard," the other replied. Sachiko said nothing, but the image of the soldiers' open hands stayed in her mind. At dusk, she walked home through the ruined streets. Smoke from makeshift stoves rose into the purple sky. Children played near the rubble, laughing in both Japanese and broken English. "Hello," "Goodbye," echoing what they'd learned from the soldiers. When she reached home, her mother was waiting by the door, a candle burning. "You look different," she said. "Tired, but lighter." "Maybe I'm just getting used to the noise," Sachiko murmured. Before sleeping, she opened Haruto's old journal again. On the next blank page, she wrote, "Today, an American said my name, not as an enemy, just as a person. I didn't know how to feel, so I said nothing, but something inside me moved." She closed the book, listening to the faint music drifting from the camp, a tune played on a harmonica, thin and lonely. For the first time, she wondered if both sides of the war had carried the same silence home with them. By early spring, the air in Tokyo began to soften. Charred trees pushed out timid buds, and the snowmelt carried bits of ash down the gutters. The city still smelled of dust and burned cloth, but the streets no longer felt haunted. Markets reopened, and people started to lift their heads when they walked. Sachiko now worked at the district office every day. Her broom had become a kind of passport. She could move freely through the building as long as she carried it. The Americans had turned the old classrooms into offices. They talked loudly, their voices filling the corridors with strange rhythms of English. Sachiko still didn't understand the words, but she began to recognize the tone: amusement, fatigue, irritation. The soldier she kept encountering was named David Miller. She learned his name by accident when another officer called to him. "Miller, bring those reports." The way the syllables rolled, Mira, sounded almost gentle. One afternoon, as she swept near the doorway, a gust of wind blew a stack of papers off a desk. They scattered across the floor like snow. Without thinking, she dropped the broom and bent to gather them. David crouched at the same time. Their hands brushed. He murmured, "Sorry," and then again, slower, "Sorry." She didn't know the meaning, but the tone said enough. He smiled, that faint, uncertain smile she had come to recognize. She bowed quickly and backed away, embarrassed. Later, as she returned the broom, she noticed a small object on the floor, a leather wallet. It must have fallen from his pocket. She hesitated, then picked it up and turned it over. Inside was a photograph. A woman with dark hair, holding a little girl. On the back, neat English letters read, "Helen and Mary, Christmas 1943. Her throat tightened. So he had a family waiting across the ocean. A wife who baked bread, perhaps. A child who asked when father would come home. Sachiko suddenly felt ashamed of her curiosity. She closed the wallet and placed it on his desk without a word. That evening, David found her by the corridor. He held up the wallet and said, "You found?" She nodded, unsure if she had understood his question, but the relief in his eyes told her she had. He touched his chest. "Thank you," he said slowly. Then, pointing at himself, "David?" He waited. She blinked, then pointed to herself. "Sachiko." He repeated it carefully. Sa-chi-ko. Sevens. The sound was awkward in his mouth, but it carried no mockery. She almost smiled, but caught herself and bowed instead. After that day, they began to exchange simple words. He brought a small notebook and a stub of pencil, writing one English word each day. He would say it aloud, and she would repeat, "Bread, water, peace." Then she would write the Japanese word beside it, pan, mizu, shui, heiwa, ping-he. Sometimes he drew pictures, a loaf of bread, a river, a white dove. It was a strange kind of language, half drawing, half gesture, but it worked. Through it, Sachiko began to see that kindness could travel without translation. One afternoon, David pointed to the word peace and asked, "In Japanese?" She said softly, "Heiwa." He repeated, "Heiwa?" She laughed despite herself and shook her head. "Heiwa. Heiwa," he said again, smiling. "Good." She nodded, and for the first time since the surrender, laughter felt safe. Still, the world outside the office had not changed as quickly. Men returning from the front looked at the Americans with clenched jaws. Some women crossed the street to avoid being seen near them. Even the children who played near the camp were scolded for it. Sachiko knew people whispered about her. The widow who cleans for the occupiers. One morning, she overheard two men arguing near the market. "We should never bow to them," one said. "They killed our sons." "And what did our sons die for?" The other replied quietly. Pride doesn't fill an empty stomach. That night, Sachiko dreamt of Haruto again. He stood in his uniform, his face half hidden by smoke. "You're not afraid anymore," he said. But it wasn't an accusation. It was almost a question. She woke before dawn. Outside, the first light of spring touched the rooftops. Somewhere down the street, an American Jeep started its engine. The sound no longer made her flinch. At the office that day, David wrote a new word in his notebook. Friend. He pointed at her, then at himself. Friend, he said, smiling. Sachiko looked at the word for a long time before replying. The syllables felt heavy and unfamiliar on her tongue. Friend. For a moment, the war seemed far away. There were no winners or losers, no emperor, no general, just two people in a broken city learning to speak without fear. When she went home that evening, her mother noticed the faint smile on her face. You spoke to one of them again, didn't you? Sachiko didn't deny it. He teaches me words. Her mother frowned. Words can deceive. Maybe, Sachiko said softly, but silence hurts more. Her mother turned away, sighing, and Sachiko knew the conversation was over. Yet that night, as the wind slipped through the holes in the wall, she whispered the new word into the dark, friend, as if testing how it might sound when the world was whole again. The first heavy rain of spring came without warning. The sky went dark in the afternoon, and the wind pushed cold air through the broken streets. Sachiko stood at the doorway and watched the clouds fall over Tokyo like a curtain. When the rain struck, it struck hard. Water ran through the cracks of her patched roof. A thin stream began to drip into a basin near the altar. Another leak opened above the stove. Her mother moved quietly, placing bowls under the steady drops. By evening, the alley had become a narrow river. Neighbors shouted to one another over the noise of water. A child cried. Someone's roof gave way with a dull crash. Sachiko climbed the ladder to the rafters and tried to push a sheet of tin back into place. The wind pulled at it. The nails were loose. She felt the ladder shake and climbed down. She could not fix it alone. The next morning, the rain still fell. An American truck stopped at the end of the alley. 4 soldiers climbed down, carrying coils of rope, a box of nails, and canvas rolls. They wore slickers over their uniforms. No rifles. One of them, tall and fair, studied the roofs with a careful eye. Sachiko recognized him at once. David Miller. The neighborhood headman stepped forward, cautious but firm. The soldiers bowed first, shallow but sincere, and the headman bowed back. In slow English and simple Japanese, they explained, repair help, no pay, safety. The headman hesitated, then pointed to the worst roofs, including Sachiko's. David looked up at the ragged tin above her doorway, then at the buckets catching water inside. He said, softly, we fix. He lifted the box of nails. Okay? Sachiko glanced at her mother. The old woman pressed her lips together, then nodded once. Let them, she said. A dry night is not a matter of pride. They began at once. 2 soldiers unrolled canvas to cover a neighbor's open beam. Another set a ladder and tied it to the eave so the wind would not throw it. David climbed with a small hammer and a pouch of nails. He moved slowly, checking each step, testing each board with his weight. From below, Sachiko passed up a length of rope and a pair of pliers. He thanked her, "Thank you," and she answered with a small nod. On the roof, the rain made a steady drumming sound. David pulled the sheet of tin into place and held it while another soldier drove a nail. The hammer slipped and struck his palm. He hissed through his teeth and drew his hand back. Blood ran in a thin line toward his wrist. He looked down, a little surprised, then tried to wave it off. "Come down," Sachiko called, louder than she meant to. He looked at her, then climbed carefully to the ladder and followed it to the ground. She took his hand without asking and led him under the eave. The skin was cut, not deep, but open. She went inside, brought out a kettle of hot water and a clean cloth. Her mother watched from the doorway, expression unreadable. Sachiko washed the blood away and pressed the cloth to the cut. David stood still, eyes on the rain, as if he did not want to look at his own hand. When the bleeding slowed, she wrapped a strip of cotton around the palm and tied it snugly. "Tight," she said, showing with her fingers. "Tight," he repeated. "Good." Then, pointing up, "Roof." He started back toward the ladder. Sachiko almost reached to stop him, then let her hand fall. He climbed again, slower this time, and finished the line of nails. The tin held. The drip in the kitchen bowl grew thin and stopped. By afternoon, the soldiers had covered 4 houses with canvas and secured 3 roofs with tin and rope. The headman brought out a small pot of barley tea and set it under a dry eave. People gathered at a polite distance. No one wanted to seem eager, but no one stayed away. The soldiers accepted the tea with both hands and drank it carefully. When their work on the last roof ended, the rain began to ease. Clouds parted to a pale band of light in the west. The alley smelled of wet dust and clean iron. David came down the ladder for the final time and wiped his brow with his sleeve. He looked at Sachiko and her mother and gave a small bow. "Dry," he said, pointing to the roof. "Better." "Better," Sachiko answered. The word felt simple and exact. Her mother disappeared inside and returned with 2 cups of hot tea and a small dish of pickled radish. She held them out, hands steady. "For work," she said in Japanese, then added, slowly, "Thank you." David took the cup, surprised, and bowed again. "Arigato," he said, careful with each sound. They stood under the eave and drank in silence. The other soldiers packed the ropes and gathered the leftover nails. Somewhere down the alley a child laughed, testing his boots in a shallow puddle. "Why do you help us?" Sachiko asked at last, the words quiet, almost lost in the soft rain. David took a moment. He touched the bandage on his hand as if to remind himself of the language they shared. Then he said, "No war now. Fix." He searched for the next word, frowned slightly, and tried again. "Peace needs roof." Sachiko looked up at the patched tin. For months, she had thought of the Americans as a weight pressing on the city. Today, they had felt like hands lifting part of it. She did not know what to do with that thought, so she said nothing. Before they left, David reached into his jacket and took out the small notebook. He opened to a clean page and wrote 1 word in neat letters: roof. Below it he wrote the Japanese beside her careful voice, "Yane." Then he drew a simple line sketch, a small house with rain falling and a roof holding. He tore the page free and handed it to her. "For class," he said. "Tomorrow?" She nodded. "Tomorrow." The truck started with a cough. The soldiers climbed aboard, wet slickers shining dull in the gray light. As they rolled away, neighbors lifted their hands in a quiet farewell. No one cheered. No one bowed deeply. But no one turned away either. That night, the rain thinned to a gentle tap. The bowls were empty. The floor was dry. Sachiko set the torn page on the shelf beside Haruto's photograph. Her mother watched her do it and did not object. They ate a small supper of rice and pickles. When her mother slept, Sachiko lit the altar candle and sat with the notebook page in her lap. She traced the word roof with her finger, then the word Yane. The paper was thin, the pencil line firm. She whispered into the quiet house, testing a thought that did not yet feel like betrayal. A dry roof is not shame. Outside, the last drops fell and stopped. The tin held. The house held. She slept without dreaming. When the rain finally stopped, The air felt rinsed clean. The old schoolyard had benches now, a canvas roof, and a sign in 2 languages. English class, free. People came because they were hungry, but they also came because they needed to learn how to live again. Sachiko arrived with a cloth bag and a quiet step. David stood at a chalkboard, balanced on an oil drum. He nodded in welcome and wrote the first words in broad, careful letters. Hello, book, apple, peace. He spoke slowly. The children echoed him, uneven at first, then steady. A few mothers sat at the edge of the benches, whispering the sounds under their breath. After class, Sachiko gathered notebooks. David pointed to the board. You help me say it right, he said. Japanese way. She hesitated, then nodded. They built a simple routine. He wrote the English word and said it aloud. She repeated it, then offered the Japanese in plain Romaji so he could shape the sounds. Pan for bread, mizu for water, heiwa for peace. If there was time, she added the characters on the board for the children, but never in the script they planned to read aloud. He tried each sound, patient and exact, until her small nod told him he was close. Women returned in the afternoons. They asked for words that could open doors. Work, clinic, paper, measure, thread. A carpenter came to learn numbers in English for the engineers. A seamstress traced cloth with her finger on the board as if testing its strength. An old man sat near the rope and never spoke, but he did not leave until the chalk stopped. At tea break, David talked about Iowa, fields, a river that froze, a sister who sang. He did not rush. He used small words and let silence do its share. Sachiko told him about the market before the war, about the first night of surrender, about how quiet had become a habit. He didn't argue with quiet. He only said, "Safe is good," then looked at the yard where boys were kicking a rag ball in a straight line of dust. Not everyone approved. One afternoon, a young man in a faded uniform stood outside the rope. A scar crossed his knuckles. When the lesson ended, he said in blunt Japanese, "Why teach us?" Sachiko gave David the sense of it in simple English. David lifted his empty hands. "No war now," he said. "Work. Talk. Build." The man stared a moment, nodded once, and left. He returned the next day and sat in the back. New words went up. Work, and she added shigoto. Home, and she added I. Trust, she printed shinrai and showed him how to split the sound. He tried, careful as if setting a nail. She said, "Good," and meant it. Near sunset, David closed his notebook. Tomorrow, new lesson. Hope. He wrote hope in block letters and passed her the chalk. She wrote kibu beneath it so the voice could carry the sound. He studied the pair and repeated it once, clean and sure. Sachiko walked home counting the new electric lamps along the main road. For months, she had walked with her eyes down. Tonight she looked up. Her mother met her at the door with a small pot of rice. "What do they teach you?" The old woman asked. "How to speak," Sachiko said, "and how to listen." "To them?" "To each other," she answered. Before sleep, she opened Haruto's journal and wrote in neat lines. Today the children tried peace. The women tried freedom. The men tried work. We all tried trust. Tomorrow we will try hope. She closed the book and sat in the clean quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a harmonica played a plain tune. She breathed with it once and tested the new word under her breath, no louder than a prayer. Kibu. Summer came early that year. The heat pressed through every broken window, carrying the smell of dust and sea salt. Life in Tokyo moved again, slow, cautious, but alive. Markets reopened. Children laughed in the streets. For the first time in years, people began to speak of tomorrow without fear. At the district office, Sachiko still cleaned floors and helped in the language class. The lessons had grown. Women came with notebooks, men with calloused hands. David had moved from single words to full sentences. We build. We work. We learn. His voice was calm, his eyes steady. To Sachiko, it felt as though he was teaching more than language. Yet outside the walls, not everyone welcomed change. Some of the older men glared when she passed. Once, a woman hissed, "You've forgotten your husband." The words cut, though Sachiko said nothing. That night, she stood before Haruto's photograph and whispered, "I have not forgotten. I'm only learning to live." A few days later, she found David waiting by the old well with his notebook. "Today, no class," he said. "Holiday." He pointed to the sky, smiling. "Sun too hot." She nodded, uncertain what he wanted. Then he held up the notebook. "You write now. Your word." "My word?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Japanese word. Important." Sachiko thought a long time, then wrote slowly, "Kokoro, heart." He looked at it, said the sound softly, and smiled. "Heart," he repeated, pressing a hand to his chest. "Good word." They sat under the shade of a half-burned tree, sharing barley tea she had brought in a small bottle. He told her about his home, about the letters that came once a month from Iowa. She told him about her mother, her late husband, and how she feared being seen as grateful to the occupiers. He listened quietly, not trying to fix her fear, only holding it with her. When the wind picked up, she stood. "I should go," she said. He nodded, then said softly, "Sachiko, war finished, but inside, still fighting?" She met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "but I want to stop." He gave a small nod, almost like a salute. "Me too." Days passed, and their small friendship became a rhythm, lessons, brief talks, shared tea. They never touched, but silence between them changed shape. It no longer felt like fear, it felt like understanding. One evening, a storm gathered over the city. The thunder rolled far off, but people hurried home. Sachiko closed the classroom shutters while David stacked books. "Rain again," he said, smiling. "Tokyo always rain." She laughed softly. "Yes, but roofs hold now." The wind pushed against the doors. Lightning flashed white through the glass, and for a moment his face looked older, tired. "When I go home," he said quietly, "I think I will miss this sound." She froze. "Go home?" "Sevens. Maybe soon," he said. "Orders come. New place. Maybe Korea." The room felt smaller. She wanted to ask when, or if he would return, but her throat closed. Instead, she said, "Then we finish lessons quickly." He smiled, though his eyes were sad. "Yes, we finish. But you keep notebook, keep words." After he left that night, Sachiko sat by the window and watched the rain slide down the glass. The sound was steady, patient, familiar. She thought of how she had once feared every soldier's footstep. Now she feared their absence. She opened her husband's journal again and wrote only one line. "Peace is heavier than silence, but I will carry it." Outside, thunder moved west. In the dark, she whispered the only English word that felt true. "Friend." Autumn came quietly, folding the heat back into the sea. Tokyo looked different now. Wooden scaffolds reached where ruins had been. Shops reopened with paper signs. Children went to school carrying small lunch boxes that smelled of rice and hope. Even the nights felt less hollow. Electricity hummed again along the main road. Sachiko worked each morning at the office and taught in the afternoons. The classes had changed. The Americans still supervised, but more lessons were run by Japanese teachers now. She noticed that women spoke louder, asked questions, even laughed without covering their mouths. Sometimes she would stop mid-sentence and think, when did we stop whispering? David still came, though less often. His uniform looked older, his notebook thicker. "Soon I go home," he said one evening, as they stacked the chalkboards away. "Orders next month. New work there." She froze, the chalk slipping slightly in her hand. "Home," she repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time. "Yes, Iowa." He smiled, but there was something tired behind it. "My little girl, she starts school now. I want to see her walk there." Sachiko looked at the floor. "You will forget this place." He shook his head. "No, I remember the roof, the class." "You?" She didn't answer. Outside, a bell from the rebuilt temple rang once, soft and long. A week later, he brought her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the old notebook they had shared, now filled from cover to cover. On the last page he had written in careful English, "You taught me that peace is not silence. It is trust." Beneath it, he had drawn a small dove. The lines were clumsy, but it looked alive. She read it twice, then folded the paper gently. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. "Keep it. Teach. Your way." When the day of departure came, the whole neighborhood gathered near the port. The Americans lined the dock, waiting for the ships that would carry them east. David stood among them, cap tucked under his arm. He spotted her in the crowd and lifted a hand. She bowed once, low and deep, as she had for her husband's funeral, but this time it was not for death. It was for gratitude. He smiled, then turned when the whistle blew. The soldiers began to board. The engines roared, scattering gulls into the pale sky. Sachiko watched until the last outline of the ship blurred into mist. Around her, people waved and wept quietly, not because they mourned the occupiers, but because something had ended that they did not yet know how to name. That night, she placed the notebook beside her husband's photograph. Her mother asked softly, "He is gone?" "Yes," Sachiko said, "but the lessons stay." Outside, the lamps flickered against the first cool wind of winter. In the distance, a group of children practiced their English song for the new school ceremony. Their voices rose through the evening air, small, unsteady, but full of life. Peace forevermore. Sachiko smiled, eyes wet but calm. The house was quiet, except for the steady tick of rain beginning again on the roof they had repaired together. She looked up at it and whispered, half in English, half in Japanese, so softly it became one language. "Peace, heiwa." The sound lingered in the room like the light that refused to go out. Winter settled in with a clean, hard light. The occupation thinned, then ended in stages most people did not mark with dates. They marked it by smaller signs. Shop shutters painted new, a tram line humming again, the sound of children drilling songs for opening day at the rebuilt school. Sachiko now taught each afternoon in a room with real windows. The benches were straight, the chalk fresh. Women came in aprons from market stalls. Men came with rough hands and careful eyes. They learned to write simple forms, to read notices, to ask for what they needed without lowering their heads. One evening, the postman came to the door with a blue airmail envelope. The paper felt thin and strange in her hands, like a leaf from a tree she had never seen. On the back was a careful English script she recognized at once. David Miller. Inside were two things: a small photograph of a girl standing in snow, and a letter written in short lines, each word chosen as if it cost something. "Dear Sachiko, Mary walks to school now. Helen says the roof will hold through winter. I remember Tokyo when it rained. I remember the class and your careful words. Peace is not silence. It is trust. You taught me that. Thank you. David. Sevens. She read it twice, then a third time, moving her finger along the line so she would not mistake a word. Her mother watched from the stove, the steam from the pot fogging the window. From the soldier? The old woman asked. Yes, Sachiko said. She set the photo under the lamp. The girl's coat looked thick. Her smile was direct and unafraid. That night, Sachiko answered in the same plain way he had written, shaping each letter with care. Dear David, Tokyo is building again. The children laugh more. I teach every day. We use the notebook. When it rains, the roof holds. I will remember your words too. Peace needs trust. Thank you. Sachiko. Sevens. She folded the page and slid it into an envelope. At the post office the next morning, the clerk weighed it gently and stamped it for the long trip east. Days filled and passed. At the office, Sachiko helped the women's committee plan small classes, accounting for shopkeepers, reading practice for mothers who had not finished school. She stood in the back of a meeting one night while a younger woman spoke at the front without lowering her eyes. No one told her to be quiet. Afterward, Sachiko walked home with her notebook under her arm and realized she had not looked at the ground once. A month later, another letter came. This time David enclosed a small line drawing, clumsy but alive, of a house under rain. Inside, his words were even fewer. We are well. I work at the mill again. Mary writes her letters now. I hope Tokyo is warm this spring. D. Evans. She smiled and propped the drawing beside Haruto's photograph. It did not feel like a betrayal. It felt like a record of a roof, a class, a season when fear had learned to step back. That week she took the class outside and had the children read signs along the street. Stop. School. Clinic. Market. Their voices carried in the cool air, bright and ordinary. A man who had once glared at the gate paused to listen. He stayed until they finished the last word, then nodded to Sachiko without speaking. In the quiet that followed, she opened the notebook to a page they had left blank months before and wrote a single pair in steady print. Future. Mirai. She did not add anything else. The line looked like a beam across a space that had once been open to the weather. That night, before sleep, she wrote one more line in Haruto's journal. Today we read the street aloud and nothing broke. She closed the book and lay down. Wind tapped once at the window and moved on. Somewhere a tram bell rang, thin and certain, like a promise kept.